kind of sad. But this was a pre-reformer. He would have probably been a little bit higher in my mind if he hadn't rejected and renounced his heresies. But he did. Okay. Epistle of Gansport, 1419 to 1489. Gansport taught at a school in Devonshire run by the Brothers of the Common Life. He studied in various universities, lectured in a place that I really want to visit called Heidelberg, where Heidelberg Confession was written, and he also lectured in Paris. He was a humanist. He was an expert in Greek and Hebrew. In his theology, he was at first a disciple of Thomas Aquinas. He loved to read Aquinas, but then he began to prefer to read Augustine of Hippo. It says here in the reading, he later turned away from Aquinas to Augustine of Hippo as a safer guide. One of the things that he denied was the infallibility of the papacy and the ecumenical councils. Again, you can see that the conversation still keeps coming back to this. This is the point of rehashing these things. You're seeing these people come back to the same things, right? Where's the authority? Where's the authority? Where's the authority? Where's the authority? So it eventually comes to sola scriptura, right? So he denies that. He had an easier end of life than John. He basically died peacefully in his bed. So he maybe wasn't as bold of a preacher as John of Weisel was, but he still did preach against the papacy. But none of his writings, this is interesting, were printed until the Reformation had started. Martin Luther, among others, issued an edition with the preface that Martin Luther wrote. And I found this really interesting. This is what Luther said, and this is a footnote in the book. Luther said this of Gansport. He said, quote, "If I had read his books before, my enemies might have thought that Luther had borrowed everything from Gansport. So great is the agreement between our spirits. I feel my joy and my strength increase, and have no doubt that I have taught correctly, when I find that someone who wrote at a different time, in another land, and with a different purpose, agrees so totally with my views and expresses them in almost the same words." That's a great little quote. So Gansport was a pre-Luther. He said he sees himself as in the same line. And he was encouraged. He says, he's built up knowing, like, okay, I am preaching the truth, because here's the other guy that's doing the same thing. He's saying the same thing. And you don't want to be alone. You don't want to be saying something that no one else is saying. For a couple of reasons. One, there's nothing new under the sun. But two, one of the things that the reformers were often accused of, and it was a very serious accusation, was being novel. They were being new. They're coming up with new doctrines. And the thing that they're trying to establish, the thing that they're really trying to say, we're not coming up with anything new. In fact, we're going back way old. We're going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We're actually reclaiming what the Catholic Church was supposed to be kind of originally about. We're going back to Augustine. We're going back to Paul, And their claim was that actually the Catholic Church has come up with new things. And it's become so embedded into the Catholic Church that you think what was actually old is new. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope it does. All right. So, much similarities there between Gansport and Luther. Third, Savonarola. First thing I want to say about him, his name is real fun to say, Savonarola. I just really like saying that. 1452 to 1498. Native of the Italian Renaissance. His city that he ministered in was Florence, or in Italian, Firenze. I think I'm saying that right. It's a very, very beautiful city. I highly recommend everyone going there. He was a Dominican friar. His preaching, and this is what he became known for, his preaching was so popular that he gained almost complete control over Florence. Now, Why did that happen? Well, part of the reason why that happened is because the ruling family in Florence, some of you know of this thing, was the Medici family, and they had a lot of power. The Medici family fled because there was a French invasion at the time. So if anything, that may have created the power gap there. And so people want to look to leadership. Well, one of the powerful preachers at the time was Savonarola, and so people began to listen to his preaching. So his popularity wasn't because Needham says that his sermons flatter people, though that does certainly make someone popular. He denounced sin and he warned of divine judgment a lot. But his moral reforms is what made the city of Florence into what Needham says, a vast monastic community. In other words, his preaching just didn't stop within the churches, it went out into the city. And it made moral reforms within the city. They had, I had never heard about this until I read this, but in 1496, they had a book burning. Well, it was more than just books, but they call it the bonfire of the vanities. So all the people in the city brought their vanities, which was essentially pornography, cosmetics, gambling, things used for gambling. They all brought it to a central location and burned it, which is actually an interesting thing to hear. I don't know why. I mean, cars, dice, all that, they burned it. I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know why I haven't heard that. You know, I would certainly like to see some kind of painting to read up more on this. Has anyone ever heard of the bonfire of the vanities?
I think there's a movie about that name, or a book or something.
Movie or a book? So I've never heard of a book.
Heard it somewhere.
I'm sure there is something. But anyway, that to me leaves a big impression because here his preaching is taking such strong root that the city is kind of, it almost feels like a revival, you know, just among the city. Let's all do this, you know. Reminds me of that event in the book of Acts, right? Remember the book of Acts where they begin to burn their idols? And then who gets upset about that? Well, the idol sellers, you know, and silversmiths and all that. And like, well, this is our livelihood, so this is not good. But anyway, so Savonarola, his preaching carried out political reforms and it drew up a new constitution in Florence. But in 1495, there was a quarrel between Savonarola and the Pope Alexander VI. Alexander did not like, the Pope did not like Savonarola's claim to be a heaven-sent messenger of Christ and didn't like his involvement in politics. I look at that and I just think Alexander's jealous of a powerful preacher. So Alexander was also under the influence of the Medici family. So the Medici family was a ruling family in Florence. They fled. They want to come back into the city. Alexander's in cahoots with the Medicis. Savonarola is there. He's preaching and he has power. You can see the political play that's going on here. So Alexander commanded, the Pope commanded Savonarola to stop preaching. So what did Savonarola do? He kept preaching. And he denounced Alexander as a servant of Satan and began preaching against the corruptions of the papal court. So what did the Pope do? He excommunicated Savonarola in 1497 and he threatened to place Florence under interdict unless it sent the rebel Dominican to Rome for trial. And what did Savonarola do? Savonarola appealed to ecumenical council against Alexander's verdict. Savonarola said, well, I want to test to see if the Pope is right or if I'm right. And this is also interesting. Savonarola didn't suggest this. It was his enemies that suggested it. The Franciscans suggested that they make a direct appeal to God's judgment. Let's not go to the Pope, right? Let's appeal to God's judgment. One of their friars and one of Savonarola's Dominicans should walk through fire. So literally a trial by fire. We'll make a fire. We're going to have a Dominican walk through. We're going to have a Franciscan walk through. And we're going to see which one makes it. So, Savonarola, what did he do? He agreed. But on the day of the test, April 1498, the Franciscans raised all sorts of objections. A rainstorm put out the fire, and night started. When night started to fall, Florence's ruling council intervened and called the whole thing off. And eventually this kind of event made people just say, it was comedic. People began to laugh the situation off, and Savonarola lost a lot of his, you might say, clout and power in the people's eyes after this. He eventually was tortured and burnt at the stake after being arrested. So, that is the story of three individuals that are preparing the way for the Reformation. Savonarola was interesting. He wasn't as radical as the other two. He just denounced the papacy, really. He wasn't as theologically radical as the other two. He was even probably more Catholic than the other. All right. So, as we're approaching the Reformation, these are some pre-reformers. But when we get into the Reformation, what is something that proved to be a very difficult hurdle for the reformers? Well, it was the medieval view of the Catholic Mass. And to understand why that was an important thing, we need to kind of describe why Mass was important to the culture and people's view of it. Just to tell you, it was very superstitious. It was extremely superstitious. And people saw Mass regularly, some people daily. So it was very much embedded into the culture. So I'm going to explain what the Catholic Mass was and how it took place in all of these areas and how people viewed it. And then you'll begin to see why the Reformers had to deal with this view of the Catholic Mass, why it was such a big deal. And that the Reformers, let me say, had differing views on it. Luther had his view of what was called consubstantiation. Calvin had his view of it. Zwingli had his view of it. And these are all reformers, and there were different views. So, all right. First that can be said is that Mass it laid at the heart of later medieval piety. When you talk to someone about what does it mean to be spiritual, what does it mean to be holy, Mass was something that they would have to refer to. Okay? It was a regular observance. It was celebrated every day in a parish church. Even though that most of the laity, most of the common church folks, only attended on Sundays. Upper class citizens who had their own chapels and chaplains, so there were some really wealthy people who would have their own chapels and chaplains, was often Mass was part of their daily routine. They would wake up, I guess possibly have breakfast or whatever, but they would go to Mass, and then after they would go to Mass, they would go hunting. It was boom, boom. That's the way they started their day, and then they would go for the hunt. Okay, so it become part of the cultural scenery. You would see people at certain times of the day. They'll be going potentially to the same location, or the rich are going to their own church. Sunday, you're going at this time for Mass. Culturally, if you're not partaking of Mass, you're a weirdo. Okay, it's odd. You're the odd man out. But the lay person rarely took communion. They rarely ate and drank. In fact, most of the people only did it once a year. They only took the elements once a year, and that was at Easter. Well, you say, well, what are they doing at Mass when they go to Mass? Why aren't they eating? They're watching it take place, actually. They're watching the priests pronounce the blessing, and they just simply watch the priest eat and drink. It'd be like coming to church every Sunday, and I would stand up here, and I would say some type of prayer or blessing or whatever. The bread and the wine would be converted into the body and the blood, and I would eat it, and you would watch, and you would receive some type of blessing, because I was your priest, and you received the type of blessing from watching it take place. It was very much it was like watching a scene take place, watching an event unfold, and it was like a holy event, and you're there as an observer, and there's a distance between you and this holy event. But since you're there, since you're in the midst of this holy event, you can feel the weight of it. It's there. He's holding the bread. He's holding the cup. He's drinking this. He's eating this, and you're feeling the weight of it, and you're hearing the words pronounced in a language that you can barely understand, if you can understand it at all, because you don't speak Latin, and you're not educated in Latin, and you never were, you speak a different language, but it's a really holy event. I'm building it up right, because this is exactly what goes on today. It's the same thing. I've heard Protestants even talk about when they go and visit Catholic churches for Mass, it's like a really somber, holy event. And they have no idea what's being done. They're utterly, completely ignorant of the words that are being said, because it's in a different language. But they can hear the echo of the singing in the halls and the glorious splendor of all the beautiful things in the cathedral that they are, and they feel, in a sense, that they're holy because of this holy environment. Does that make sense? Okay. It's going to continue, right? There's an inaccessible nature to Mass. Like, I'm here, but that holy thing is there. I can't touch that. And people liked that. And what further separated, I've already alluded to it, was Latin. Most people could not understand Latin. It served to give the impression that it's a special, rare thing, and it's mysterious. Does that make sense? And you almost feel that way. You almost feel that way even if you hear some other language, or even if you watch something and you hear Latin being said or spoken or whatever. Let me just tell you, Latin was as common as the English I'm speaking right now at one point. And it got translated and then it died, and people kept reading and speaking it in church, and all of a sudden it became a sacred thing. There's nothing sacred. In fact, it was, what the Latin Bible's called? It's called the Vulgate. And we get the word Vulgate from vulgar. And the word vulgar means common. They translated the Greek literally into the common language, the vulgar language of the people. And you've used the word vulgar. Well, that's kind of vulgar, isn't it? You vulgar, you use it in terms of like, that's kind of base, that's kind of dirty or rough. Well, that's an adjusted meaning of the more ancient term. It just means common. The Latin Common Bible is what it would be. Does that make sense? But the fact now, at this point in history, they can't understand Latin, separated them from the event. There's an inaccessible, mysterious nature to it. Though, I will say that in England there were books that there was a book that was called the Lay Folks Mass book that kind of helped people understand more what was going on. But certain parts of the Mass were felt to be, listen, I love this, too holy for translation into the common tongue. Think about the absurdity of that for a second. Too holy for translation into the common tongue. And Latin was the vulgar tongue. It was the common tongue. Does that make you see how ridiculous that is? I hope you do. So, they tried to compensate, the church tried to compensate for the illiteracy of the people, even if you could read in your own language, or even if you couldn't speak Latin. Many people couldn't read in their own language anyway. They were illiterate. So they had to use symbols. So they had rituals in the Mass that helped kind of people understand it, that try to impress upon people the sorrow of Jesus' crucifixion and his death, and so on and so forth. And stories begin to kind of emerge and abound. Miracle stories surrounding the Mass. So the Mass is becoming this miraculous event. Why is it miraculous? Because the body and the blood is transformed, or the bread and the wine are transformed with the body and the blood, and there's miracle stories. So here's one that I'll read for you by Cesares Heiserbach, Dialogue of Miracles. He says, a priest named Albero was once celebrating Mass in the church of St. Walburgis, or Walburgis, I don't know how to pronounce that. This was in Hildesheim, where the priest had been born. A citizen who was standing behind the priest and had no faith in what was being done, saw the fluid in the chalice bubble over. It covered the whole surface of the altar, brimming over like a boiling vessel. And the citizen was very much frightened by this vision, and it hopefully reestablished him in his faith in the sacrament. And indeed, this overflowing fluid looked just like human blood. So this is holding the cup, and the cup begins to bubble and open, and covers all the table and everything. And he had no faith, and now all of a sudden it's establishing him in the faith, because he's having this vision of this taking place. The emotion of awe towards the Mass was to be an acute practical problem for the Reformers. just watching it take place. And so this was a huge hurdle. Why? Because people began to look at the Eucharist meal in a superstitious way, right? I look at this as similar to the way that they took the serpent. Remember the bronze serpent in the wilderness in the Old Testament? They were to look to and be healed. Well, eventually, what happened to that? People began to lift that up, and they began to worship it, and it became an idol in the history of Israel. And so you're taking now this idea of communion, and you're making it into a superstitious meal. But that's heavily embedded in people's minds. And, you can't touch Mass. You can't let go of that. For instance, here's an example. When Andreas von Karlstadt insisted that a layman, just a regular church-going person, take the bread into his own hands, the poor man trembled so violently that he dropped it, which dropping it is not seen as a good thing. Luther condemned Karlstadt's command to do that. He thought that was too far. You shouldn't do that. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's wrong at all. Here, we take it in our hands and we hold it up. By the way, if you drop it, you're not dropping Jesus' body. I just want you to know that. Okay, you're dropping a piece of bread that's not very appetizing, just so you know. Is it even bread, really? It's like a cracker. Who knows? A little piece of something. What's important is it's a memorial. And our faith is being renewed by remembering what Christ has done. Okay. But anyway, he's shaking so hard he can't even hold it because of his understanding of it, the superstition behind it. So the Mass was seen as a meeting place of earth and heaven in most people's mind. So people would pray for souls that were in purgatory. And that was a routine thing that people did during the Mass. They also thought that a power was made available during Mass, a power against demonic forces. So such forces were thought to operate in illness, plague, crop failure.
Explain a little bit about what you know about that purgatory.
This purgatory, again, comes from the Holy Latin language of purgare, which means to purge or to cleanse. It's a holding cell.
They believe that, I guess, you spend that amount of time there and then you come out, and then they don't believe there's a heaven and hell.
They do, I think, they believe in heaven and hell. But most people go to purgatory, stay there for a really, really long time, pay off for their sins, and to be purged from their iniquities, and then go to heaven.
And everybody gets to go to heaven.
I don't know if everyone gets, I don't think everyone does get to go to heaven. I don't know about how that works with hell. There is no such thing as purgatory, I should say that. That is entirely made up. And I don't mind that being on record, and I don't mind all my friends hearing it. But yes, the Pope retained the ability to free souls from purgatory. And that's one of the things that Martin Luther eventually wrote in his 95 Theses. I think Martin Luther may have actually held to purgatory. I don't know, for his whole life. Maybe he questioned it at the end. But his critique was the Pope with him on his journeys as a charm against bad luck and make use of it to cure illnesses. See how weird this gets? So that's the first thing. That's superstition right there. And they held, this is their view of Catholic. I'm going to go in and feel this holy event, this holy spectacle. And if I could take part of this bread and run out of the church with it, and I've got some in my mouth, I've got now a token against demonic forces like that are controlling the weather and all this stuff. So that's superstition number one. The second thing is they're seeing demonic forces as controlling things like weather and illnesses and death. When if you look at the scriptures, God controls all these things. The good one.
Yeah,
So
we're not coming together to worship the one who is in control. They're coming as some kind of religious ceremony to ward off evil spirits.
yeah, it's really odd, superstitious kind of. But their view of God was kind of too small. The view of God was too small. So that's another. But who do you put the blame to for that? Well, you put the blame to the teachers. We need a reformation. We need a renewal for sure. It got so bad, apparently, that, people would steal the bread. They had to, in the Fourth Lateran Council, decreed that communion bread and wine had to be kept locked away safely because people they had a council, and in the council in 1215, they had to make sure that the communion bread was locked away. So it wasn't being stolen and used for superstitious purposes. So this was a bizarre aspect. Now, I'm not saying that's how everyone thought. I'm saying that's how some people for sure thought. And it was a hurdle that the reformers had to deal with. Okay. Let me give a few notes because I have a few minutes left because I'm coming to the end of this chapter. We looked at humanism. We've looked at the Renaissance, the rebirth, the return to the sources. We looked at Desiderius Erasmus and how things in the culture, the broad culture, are just ready for a reformation. But let me explain, and I'll do this really quickly, what the reformers are trying to do, what John Calvin was trying to do, what Martin Luther was trying to do, and so on and so forth, when we get to these people. They are not trying to be, and I think the word Protestant, I may agree with this, may not be the best term. They're not protesters. They want to actually not take away the Catholic Church, they want to renew it. They had seen the Catholic Church as something that was good, Mother Church, that had become corrupt. Does that make sense? And so they wanted to not start something new or novel, because new and novelty were often associated with heresies. And they don't want to be heretics. They want to be faithful to the Bible, and they want to be faithful to the church fathers, and they saw that the church had erred from people like Augustine on the sovereignty of God, on the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of salvation. And so they want to go, if you will, back, way back, and retrieve those things that were lost. Some people have looked at the reformers and they say, and we'll cut this off too, they say, well, Martin Luther and these other guys, they were the precursor to revolutions. I think if you understand Martin Luther and Calvin, they would not want a revolution either. I'm not saying that people didn't take what they had said and their ideas and went in a different direction. They probably very well did. But if you look at it, here are people that are going against the established authority. They're interpreting the Bible on their own. They don't need the papacy or the clerics to interpret the Bible for them. They can do it on their own. You see? Well, this idea of doing this on your own and not being under authority could potentially go into other areas of life too, political, and so on and so forth. But again, I don't think Luther or Calvin wanted that either. The idea of revolution goes further than what the reformers were about. Revolution can get into lots of bloodshed and lots of bad things. Some people look at secularism as coming from the Reformation, and this is, I don't think, good either. What's happening is, and you'll see this if you ever read Luther, if you ever read Calvin, they will say things like, they want to be Catholic. any questions or comments? So I will say, if we're still being recorded, I don't know or not, this is a general summary of church history and even the Reformation. If you're into really deep reading, you can go get Matthew Barrett's book, Reformation as Renewal. And it's a much thicker book with much smaller print. And it's probably going to be a lot more thorough than this type of book. I can think of at least one person in the audience who will read that book, and I'm not going to point many fingers.